gentlemen, I have a very special guest today. I have Kevin Kiniry formerly from DC DC Collectibles. We're going to talk about his life. And here he is. Kevin, thanks for joining us.
Thank you so much for having me. This is like such a treat. I
Oh,
love talking about this stuff all the time. So having somebody who actually wants to talk about it is like just so refreshing, especially during a
oh,
quarantine.
oh man. Well, I'm hoping that like some of the folks who don't know you from your years at DC are going to get a lot of fun stories and behind the scenes. And it's kind of you're not there right now because now you can tell all this stuff. You
Well,
know?
that's the thing. It's about 2 years out now. And so,
Yeah.
yeah, I guess I feel like free to
I
say whatever.
know, I'm gonna slide on and put my AC on before I start getting a little sweaty. I'm in my shed in my backyard, so
I
that's
love
where
how you've decked it out, though. That is
thank you.
impressive.
I appreciate it. It's
Much more impressive than mine.
now yours is classy and clean. So I work from here now, obviously during COVID. So now everyone I work with knows about my collection, my customers. Like, so it's a little much sometimes.
What do
Because,
they say? Are they like so
like,
impressed?
well, they're like, hey, that's a lot of cool stuff, you know? And it's cool now, but when I was growing up, this was not cool. This is totally not cool, you
No,
know?
we
But
still
now
live
it's
in a golden age. Yeah.
exactly, now it's a good talking point. So that's a good thing. Okay, let's talk about you. So first, can you kind of just tell me, what you have a long career at DC, but just tell me about like your last position there, what you were doing there before you left.
Yeah, my last position, because I was there for 17 years at DC Comics, both when we were in New York City and then when
Yeah.
we became part of DC Entertainment and moved out to LA in like 2010. And all my roles have always been the like non-editorial comic stuff. So like, the comic thing, obviously the core of the business, but I was always in like the licensing, the product, the like, all the other brand management-y stuff around that. And so when I moved out to California in 2010, I was put in charge of a creative services department, and it was like a very catch-all. We did a lot of different things, but one of those things was the DC Collectibles / DC Direct business,
Yeah.
or the creative at least was the start of it. And then as the years went on, they like threw it all under me, and they were like, why don't you just handle the entire like little department? Which was crazy because obviously I was
Yeah.
coming at it from a more creative side, and then they're like, handle the business too. But that was probably the main job for the last probably 2 years that I was there. So we're talking like 2015 to 2017 was
Yeah.
just like the DC Collectibles business.
Okay.
Before that, I was doing some other stuff and that, but that was like just focus on that for those last 2 years.
Yeah.
And then sadly, like DC Direct is no longer,
Yeah.
officially they're wrapping up now, which is the other kind of nice way in a way to have this talked. It's kind of like a true
Good timing. Yeah.
end of an era kind of thing.
Kevin, how did you end up at DC in the first place? You were there for I think 17 years altogether. Like, what led you there?
I mean, I know this is going to sound ridiculous, but like white privilege does it a lot
Yeah.
because it's when I think about it, you go back to that time
Yeah.
of like, well, I wanted it. Like there's
Yeah.
a sense of like, I moved to New York from Philadelphia, so I'm an East Coast guy. And when I moved to New York, it's a very expensive city to live in.
Sure.
And I remember saying to myself, well, if I'm going to live here, I want to have a unique job that I can't do anywhere else, which is why I'm here in New York. And I was a big fan as a kid of comic books, more Marvel than DC, funny enough, but like
It's okay. It's all right.
but comic books in general, I still loved them
Yeah.
all. And I knew that both Marvel and DC were located in New York.
Yeah.
And so I thought, I'll just get a job at one of those. And I had joined this group at the time. It was interesting because again, it's all about networking, even at a
Yeah.
young age, because I was, in my early 20s at the time. And I would just go online and I would apply. Like I remember, I still remember Mary Sprouse is her name. She's I think still the head of HR over at Marvel Comics, because I sent so many resumes to her over like 2-year period for every job that anything that came up. For a brief moment, I was a temp receptionist at Marvel Comics for
You got in. Look.
3 days.
Yeah.
And then one of the guys came up to me and he started saying like, are you interested in something else? And I thought he was talking about getting a job at Marvel.
Yeah.
Literally, he was asking me if I wanted to be Spider-Man for like their tours of the office. And I was like, no, I don't think I'm going to do that. But I loved it for a moment. I almost was
Yeah,
kind
I
of
was like, well, maybe.
yeah, but
Yeah.
I was like, no, you don't want to see me in tights. Like
Yeah.
that was pretty much that discussion. But then I had joined a gay comic book reading group in New York
Yeah.
because I was like, I wanted to, kind of know people who had similar interests. And I was like, gay and comic books, does that work out? And like
Yeah.
weirdly, there was a group in New York that did this.
That's
And
awesome.
so I became friends with a bunch of different people there. And through there were a couple people who were always talking about like working at the comic companies. And one of the guys there who ran a comic shop was connected because DC would back in the day would call a bunch of comic shops and ask them, hey, do you want to buy this comic? Do you want to buy that comic? So he was kind
Yeah.
of connected, and he was able to get a job in the marketing department at DC. So about 6 months after he got a job, I saw, as I would always look in my temp jobs, there was this job posting for a licensing coordinator. And I was like, I don't know what that is,
Yeah.
but I'll read the job, what they have to do. Sure, I can do all that. So I sent my resume in, but I also sent it to a friend who had the job there. And that's so important to get any job. I got to tell you, it's like
Yeah.
the best way to get in is because the algorithms or the way that HR groups, especially nowadays, take
Oh,
in
sure.
resumes, unless you have somebody who like hands it to somebody, it like never gets seen even.
It's tough. Yeah.
So while it didn't get me the job, it got me the interview. And then I was able to get the job through the interview. And honestly, I went into this interview and I didn't want to be an editorial. I was a rare one because I loved comics, but I
Yeah.
didn't have this desire to be a writer or an artist,
Yeah.
or, I wasn't a frustrated editor or what, any of those things. So when I went in, that's like 90% of the questions they were asking. This is like in the year 2000. So 90% of the questions they're asking are like, well, are you sure you just don't want to be an editorial? Are you only taking this job so you can get to the comic books?
Yeah.
It's like, look, no, I love toy. I grew up in the like Lucasfilm era of the 70s and 80s of
Oh
like
yeah.
toys everywhere. So for me, product is king.
Yeah.
And so that was how I kind of started. I was able to get the job. They were a little hesitant about like giving me the job, and then from there I just moved up through the ranks while I was there for 17 years.
That's impressive how you got in and then just moving up through the ranks like you did. I mean, I thought I knew what you did, but I started going through your LinkedIn just to get a little more background. I'm like, holy shit, he's done a lot of things at DC, not just DC Collectibles by any means, like so many things.
Well, that was the fun part of the job. This is like, I loved my time at DC.
Yeah,
Really, I did. It was magical. And I knew it at the time, but then you really know it after you leave. You know what I
sure.
mean? Like you think you know it, and then you're like, okay, I get it. This is great. But what I used to always say when I worked there was every day was different. I didn't know what I was going to be working on
Yeah,
because it was so vast. Being part of DC and the DC brands, you knew that they appealed to everything from, I worked on things for infants
yeah,
to people who are like 90, you know what I mean? Like, and it went
sure.
all the way through all of those age groups, all these types of kinds of experiences. The media that we did hit all these different kinds of things from the, young animation to the older animation to the movies and TV. And I got to help make things that hopefully people who felt fondly about that, could
Yeah.
take with them. That was the perfect job. It was really great.
That's awesome, and I love your mindset about being in New York. Like, if you're gonna live in New York, you want to get a job that you can't get anywhere else because it's a hard city to live in, right? It's expensive,
Oh
you know.
yeah.
It's like, so you're right. Like, why just be? I mean, sure, you can be there for the experience of living there for a little while, but if you're gonna stay there, you're right. You might as well get a job that's something you love, right?
And that was tricky. And it's tricky because comic books don't pay a lot. Like the comic book
Yeah,
companies, because unfortunately, and this is our world right now, desirable jobs, fun jobs, jobs that could be fulfilling like that, know it. And so that their salaries are always much lower
sure.
because they're like, well, and like, and funny enough, I thought I was so lucky because I worked in the licensing brand management department,
Yeah,
and I got paid more than the poor assistant editors because
sure.
that was considered a more desirable job. And so they were having to live with their families still and commute in and like talk about a labor of love. I was able to like eke out a very, small, simple existence, but it's rough. You had to do it because
Oh
of the
yeah,
love.
absolutely. And
but it was worth it. I would totally do it again. It was
yeah.
great.
Well, you mentioned something earlier, if you don't mind me asking. You mentioned like the gay comic book club that
Hmm.
you joined. Like growing up, was that like were I don't want to. If it's too personal, don't feel like you have to talk about it. But
Oh
like,
no, go for it.
all right, I was gonna ask like growing up, did you like have gay friends in Philadelphia? Like when you came to New York, did you feel more, kind of liberated? But it's a little bit more I don't know,
I I
accepting.
came out. I mean, like I used to think
Yeah,
growing up. Funny enough, I used to think Philadelphia was a small city. Like
yeah,
I thought that was a small town because New York was close enough that New York was this big world city.
yeah,
Then I went out to college in a small town, like in the middle of Pennsylvania, because it was a nice, affordable state college. And then I saw a small town, like, and then I was like, oh, I get it. And when I left college, I was like, I'm moving right to New York. I can't like go back to
gotcha.
Philly. But I came out in college, so I was in this like smallish town where it was a little smaller like community. Is when I finally came out. Since coming out day was just a couple days ago, so this is my
Yeah,
little coming out part. And that's part of the appeal of New York is like, hey, it's a bigger city, it's more diverse.
yeah,
Because again, growing up in Philadelphia, Philadelphia is really racially divided. It's a bigger city, but like it's very much sections of a city. And there was something appealing, especially after living for school in a small town, to go to a big city with lots of different people.
yeah.
It's almost like you don't have to travel because being a world city, everybody comes through New York at some
Right.
point. And so my experience and my eyes get, wide open by being in this bigger, cooler city. So that was a draw. But the being gay part was also part of the thing of like, well, yeah, you can be freer in New York. You're
Sure.
going to meet more people who are maybe like you, or everybody's different. And so then it's even cooler because nobody is trying to be one thing.
Absolutely.
Um, and then growing up with comic books, it's like, the message in comic books, which it seems in this world right now that a lot of people have missed, is like, being different isn't bad.
Yeah.
And there is a thing from like why I love, people love, especially in the gay community, they love like the X-Men or the Teen Titans,
Right.
because there's this sense of community and family of
Yeah.
misfits or, people kind of fitting together. And, especially with the X-Men, that can, so many people can take the X-Men story and understand it, because it is about just even adolescence feeling different, and things happen at adolescence. But it was great for the gay community. I know, like, there's a lot of Jewish kind of stories through that as well, that kind of relate to this outsider mentality, being persecuted kind of thing.
And I,
So
and kind of
comic books.
speaking of that, I'm sorry, speaking of that a little bit, I
Mhm.
don't want to get too political here, but you have Comics Gate now.
Yes.
And what are your thoughts on that? Given
It
kind of
makes
like
me
what you
so
just talked about.
sad. It
Yeah.
makes me so sad because, again, it's like you want to call everybody into the room and like, come on, people, did we not all read the same stuff?
Right.
Can we like not get together on this? Like the fact that someone can claim that these characters aren't trying to tell you moral, ethical kind of thing. Like that's the whole point. Like comic books are the new fairy tales. They
Yeah.
are the new parables from the Bible. Like they were the stories that said right and wrong. And they were very clear, at least to me. And to then take that and corrupt it to things where it's like not everybody is welcome, not everybody is equal. That is so wrong and such a bastardization of what this medium is about,
Yeah.
which should be celebration and joy and inclusion, that it makes me angry.
Yeah.
I hate it. I I hate that it's a reaction to a very small group of scared people. It's all about fear of losing power, of losing a voice, of losing all this stuff they think they have, when there's definitely a sense of we are stronger together. Again, what's the message from these team books? From
Absolutely.
people come together,
Yeah.
from Voltron to the Power Rangers, like
Oh
we
yeah.
are stronger together. And dividing and making us feel less than, I mean, I just don't get it. I don't, it's like, it's so bizarre to me. I'm like, what did you read? How did you miss
Yeah.
this? Why would you think Batman would ever side with you? Like, what,
Right.
like, there are these things where it's like, how did these characters, like, they're clear.
Right.
There are clear messages. So
Yeah.
it's almost dumbfounding to me more than anything.
Absolutely. Well, I can talk about this stuff all day too. You're so
Yeah.
interesting, and I love your perspectives on things too. But I want to bring it back to DC Direct. I want to talk about these guys. I want to talk
Yeah.
about the figures. So tell me about, if you could, Kevin, like, were you there for the formation of DC Direct? Were you there when it like first started?
I
Like,
came in just after. So I think it started
okay,
around like 1998 and I started in 2000. So it had been
yeah,
going for about 2 years. But by that point, again, almost like to what you were holding up, it was still in the early stages. And so they
okay,
were only releasing maybe about, like 8 figures in a year or something like that.
right,
It was the like weird like 2 box, set of like Promethea or something, like weirdo things were
yeah,
coming out. But when I started, just as a side thing, so I
yeah,
was in the licensing / brand management group. So I always had this weird relationship with DC Direct at the time because I was assisting Hasbro and Mattel. So I was the contact through like that group that worked
oh,
for their
okay,
toy lines. And so we would have this weird relationship of like, the whole reason DC Direct started was because they were frustrated with the Hasbro relationship and they needed to carve out the ability to do something.
So that's a good point right there. So is that, so it was because of that? Because I remember I collected Hasbro, Mattel, and it was all Batman pretty much, especially from Hasbro. That was it. All you got was Batman. So is that, were there people within DC Comics who were like, hey, they have all these other characters that they're not touching? And is that kind of why DC Direct came about?
So I started, in 2000. At that point, it was like the end of the Hasbro era because like while I was there, I think 2001 is when Mattel came on. So
That's
I'd
right.
been there. I was there for like the whole Mattel relationship,
Yeah.
at least at the time from the beginning. So I saw that transition of Warner. So what happens is Warner Brothers Consumer Products, part of the Warner Brothers family,
Yeah.
they're dedicated to the product. So they were the exclusive licensing agent, but they came to DC when it was any DC property to say, what do you want us to do? And our brand management group was the one to kind of help them with that. But
Gotcha.
they're always looking for the opportunity, the money. And they knew Hasbro was like not doing great stuff by the end. There were no
Sure.
new big movies. And again, this is 99,
Right.
2000. The whole thinking there is like, well, if you don't have a movie, we're not that interested.
Yeah.
And there was a guy who was at Hasbro who would always mouth off about like villains don't sell. And we would be like, so like Darth
Oh.
Vader, and because like they would have all
Yeah.
these things and they're
Ridiculous.
like, villains don't sell, villains don't sell, they just want Batman, they just want Batman.
Yeah.
And so you can see those last couple of years of Hasbro being very much this like mission masters and things where it's like Batman in different suits,
Yeah.
zebra Batman, whatever it would be. And it was starting to get frustrating. So by 98 even, it was already frustrating. And that's when like a couple people, one of the big proponents is George Brewer, who obviously was there right at the beginning, but he wasn't the only one. There were a couple other people, Cindy Barwick, and then eventually Cheryl Rubin came in. But there were a lot of people who were there. And Paul Levitz was smart at the time to say, maybe we can find a way to have our cake and eat it too.
Yeah.
We know there are fans. Paul, and especially because this is when we were still all in New York too,
Yeah.
there was definitely a love of the comic community, comic shops, the way that this world, like the fans, it was exactly what you think. The fans were also working there. It's
Right.
not like we had too many people there who are like, I don't know, it's just a job. Every once in a while you'd find that like in accounting, and I'm like, why do you have an accounting job at DC if you
I
don't
know,
care about
right?
this? But
Exactly.
other than that, majority of people and even half of the accounting department like loved this stuff.
Yeah.
And so people were always trying to find out ways to make it work. And this was one of those things of like, maybe there's a way we can figure out, because Hasbro isn't doing it, maybe we could do it ourselves.
Yeah.
And I think they started with a couple statue type test things
Right.
where they did something that weren't action figures at all. But the action figure business especially was where they were like, what can we do that's different? And they were able to get permission because at that point Hasbro was starting to lose interest. But Hasbro paid a lot of money for a master license. Nobody thought at the time. They were just like, throw money at it. They have this master license. So like I think almost every time they wanted to do a figure, they had to send like a little form in and be like, this is the figure we want to make. Is this one okay?
Yeah.
Is this one okay? And of course, no Batman or Superman. That was like, no way.
Right.
But then the Mattel relationship, when that was coming in,
Yeah.
DC Directed existed now for like 2 years, two and a
Right.
half years. And so there was the easy thing of like, well, when you do the deal,
Yeah.
don't give them everybody, and let us do a variation if it's like, and this is where like the weird like kind
Yeah.
of if it's comic book related, if it's from a comic story, it's different than if it's just a Batman or a Superman.
I remember when that happened because when I started collecting DC Direct from '98, and it was really cool, but you couldn't do Superman or Batman, so you had super obscure characters, which was awesome.
Right?
It
Like
was
the first one was like
perfect.
Alfred E. Newman, Swamp
Yeah,
Thing, and like I forget who the third one was, like
I think it was
Spectre or something like
Sandman,
that.
maybe. Yeah,
Yeah, maybe it was, yeah. Like
and it was like
great.
I remember the rumors, and back then it was just message boards that Hasbro was going to lose the license, and that you guys were going to be able to do that. How did you guys pull that off? Because like, was Mattel okay with you doing your own Superman and Batman?
So, in general, like the big toy companies want no competition at all.
Right.
Like they just would prefer nothing. But they're not in control when the contracts are being written necessarily if they really want it. And for Mattel, you got to look at it from their point of view. They were the girls' toys back in the day, like compared to the Hasbro was like the boys' toys a lot in the aisles, when the aisles would be like themed like that. And so they were looking, because by that point Masters of the Universe wasn't a big thing for them, and that was their own brand. They didn't have licenses to any of the real big boy brands. They were all with other people, mostly with Hasbro. And so this was a coup for them to be able to get the DC properties, because to them that would help them get their foot in the boy aisle.
Yeah.
So they were a little bit at a disadvantage maybe in the negotiations of like saying we want it all or nothing.
Yeah.
Plus there was a discount. They didn't pay as much probably as Hasbro did initially because they weren't getting everything. So it
Oh,
was
interesting.
cost effective for them to get mainly Superman and Batman without having to pay for the whole DC universe.
Did
But then that freed up DC Direct to be able to do more without having to ask permission each time on some other smaller characters around the edge.
and then like you have was this all DC Comics negotiating with Hasbro, or did you have to go through like Warner
It's
Brothers?
all Warner Brothers Consumer
Yeah.
Products doing the contract, but before they go to the table to negotiate, we basically are like, hey, we want you to try and do this, 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 and this.
Yeah.
Now, Warner Brothers could, because they were Warner Brothers, they could say like, no, we're not going to lose Mattel's deal just for this thing. So if
Right.
a point was probably going to be contentious, they weren't going to fight for it that much, but they didn't have to, because again, Mattel's like, well, we're never going to do the Justice Society of America. Like
Right.
there's certain characters they wouldn't even know. They literally were buying it for Batman and Superman. And they were, I think, being sold as separate licenses. There was a Batman license
Yeah.
and a Superman license. And Batman had the Batman-related villains and characters and, friends. But you couldn't do the Justice League with that. That wasn't enough.
Right.
But they didn't care about the Justice League back in 2001. That didn't matter to them.
So so Hasbro's over, Mattel gets the license. Now you guys can do Superman and Batman. How excited were you guys when that happened? Like, did you start planning right away? What was that like?
It was huge. I mean, it was game changer in a way, because again, what brings in the money? What's the notable characters? It's Batman and it's Superman. I mean, you'll see the early ones were a lot of retro things,
Right.
because again, it's like how do we form our little bubble versus what's going on the outside? And so there was a lot of like very specific artist style, or the Silver Age pack, I think, that was like Superman and Superboy or whatever it was, I think, of the Superman family. Like they would do all these like really retro kinds of things to make sure it was different, but also it felt like those were the things that nobody had gotten for years.
Absolutely. I mean, that was a great thing. You walk into a comic book store and you have these really cool, beautifully designed figures that were artist specific.
Yep.
What did that do for the comic book stores having DC Direct? Were they excited about it? Like, were they selling really well?
Well, and I think that you didn't, because it was a small startup kind of feel to this group, you didn't have to sell the hundreds of thousands that like a Mattel and a Hasbro had to sell.
Yeah.
But we're also like, there was, in a way, the group was considered like a marketing effort, because it wasn't even like meant to be a big profit maker per se, as much as it was support of these comic shops, so that when you walked in, you had like other stuff or very comic specific stuff for those fans. So yeah, they were a little more expensive at the time, but they were also not a lot made. and it was meant to kind of pump that up. So yeah, I think the comic shops liked it a lot because it was a neat, very specific, in the know kind of product. George Brewer was great at that. He was, again, a big fan. He loved the classic ages of comics, and so he was bringing out things that nobody had seen in 3D
Yeah,
from,
like
from
yeah,
us.
this guy, like a Jericho action figure.
Jericho,
Like, look at this
amazing.
guy. You know what I mean? So, what was the character selection like? How did you guys like pick this line to do, or like what was the thought process behind it?
I mean, a lot of times there was some personal favorites thrown in,
Yeah,
that people would do, and they're like, I like this character. But sometimes there was like, I don't want to say the gimmicks and stuff, but there was like, but you notice a lot of them were called like staction figures at the beginning. There wasn't as much
yeah,
articulation because, again, remember, this is a company learning how to
yeah.
make action figures. There was not an office over in China making them. They didn't know how to do some of the engineering maybe, and so it was like limiting how much they moved helped the quality of the figure
Sure.
hold together. But like the cool kind of things like adding glow in the dark for the Spectre, or
Yeah.
like being able to do the Starfire hair stand where she
Oh
sat
yeah.
into it. Like there was like, I don't want to say gimmicks as well, but there was like this fun play idea of like how to get action into these figures. How do they look
Absolutely.
like they're moving and posing? And so there was a lot of time spent to that. But from a quirkiness of like, when you don't have Superman and Batman's worlds to play in, it makes you, find some really interesting other characters.
Absolutely. And
You
what I
know,
loved about it, even after you got Superman and Batman, it didn't just become like the Superman and Batman line. You
no,
know, you guys really still. I actually wanted more Superman and Batman when you guys first got them back, but you guys were very smart about it, and you still did all these other obscure characters. And I remember for a while there was just so many figures coming out when you guys really hit your stride. You
I
know?
think the biggest stride was right before I like got totally involved. Was probably right with the Blackest Night lines when they were
Yes.
like, when I mean, part of it is like that is a perfect mix of a really great long storyline
Right.
that is popular, that follows a bunch of characters you didn't even have to worry about from like the other licensees because
Yeah.
nobody outside of the company cared about it necessarily, but the fan base is going crazy over it. It has a ton of characters in it.
Right.
The characters are like sometimes recognizable but in new ways, so you can even reuse some body parts and things like it was a perfect like, mixing of that.
And so speaking of the Blackest Light, I have a bunch of them back there. You can't
I
see.
see, I see.
Um, how did that like? How much coordination was there with the comic book guys? Do you hear about the storyline way ahead of time? You're like, wow, this is a great opportunity for us, or how did it come about?
I would say in my entire time, it never 100% worked well.
Okay,
Meaning, like it was never perfect.
yeah,
But over the years, the groups would try different ways to communicate. And partially it's because depending on who was in charge of editorial or what book you were talking about, things changed last minute sometimes. Like, and so they never felt really secure to talk too far in advance.
yeah.
Meanwhile, you're making product and you need to know a year in advance, maybe longer, like maybe a year to two. I mean, literally, because
Oh
it's
wow,
print for them, they can make changes 2, 3 months beforehand sometimes in storylines. So that was always the struggle. It wasn't that anybody was trying to keep information, but it's like, well, I want to work until I'm creative, and so do I, but my
yeah,
creative time is 2 years difference. So that would be a struggle. In the case, I mean, Glorious Jeff Johns on that storyline had really thought it out. Like he's a planner, he loves his
yeah,
stuff. So from a writing point of view, he was more organized or more thought out than what editorial normally would do for a story. So that's the first part of the mix. He's
right.
coming with more information than you're ever going to have. There would be like regular editorial meetings and somebody from like DC Direct would like join, or mostly it was like George Brewer being connected in to like what was happening. And he's like, okay, I hear this is coming up, or
Yeah,
so-and-so is writing something and they're actually prepared and ready. And there's a lot of fondness. Like I have my little Green Lantern shirt on
there it
here.
is.
There's a fondness of the Green Lantern mythos because for a lot of people it was the hadn't gotten any love media wise, and so it was really a comic booky thing.
Absolutely.
So I think there was that mixed with, I mean, the idea of the colors, the colored lanterns. I still go back to the fact like you make anything that's like candy and people want to buy it. They don't know why, but they're like hungry for it, literally hungry for it. And so the different colors was almost a primary young kind of, you know, speaking to your youth, as well as just this idea of work. Like, it hits so many buttons that I think everybody caught on that it's like, oh, you're going to do an orange lantern and you're doing yellow lantern. Okay, I get this. And it just was something everybody wanted to commit to. And then as Jeff wrote more and more of it, it helps because the story's still going on when the product comes out now.
Right.
So instead of it being like 2 years after, 3 years after, and people have forgotten it, you've worked out this magical thing where we knew about it a little bit in advance. We were able to work on it, and the story's still going. Perfect.
And did you get to talk to Jeff about it? Like, did he find out you guys were doing it and got to see some of the figures and things like that?
What I found is a lot of, not all, but a lot of the comic writers especially, and some of the artists too, are fans of product too. Like, they love toys. And it's an honor to have something of theirs, especially a character they've created or a storyline they've done, to kind of be shown in physical product. It's like you made it when somebody has decided to make your thing. You've obviously done a good enough job. But Jeff especially loved that idea of the bigger merchandising around his things. So he was really aware of it, which is, you know, eventually he was in charge of DC Collectibles. Like, he was my boss.
No kidding.
He came in, yeah, which people might not know.
Oh.
When I moved out to California, Jeff came on as a staff member, as an executive, as chief creative officer. And under him was a creative services and a creative affairs department. So DC Collectibles then at the time was under DC creative services. So he was my boss, who I oversaw like some of that stuff, because he loves this stuff. And at that point, it was coming off of Blackest Night. I think, you know, they had done all the colored lanterns and Blackest Night had happened. Then we moved out to California. He's trying to get all this TV and movie stuff going. But he also is like, hey, what else can we do? And let's get, you know, other writers and other storylines and other things.
So it sounds like it was good working under him. He sounds like he was supportive of you guys and what you were doing.
Oh, he's super creative. Like, you know what I mean? Like, that's what's fun. Like, again, it was definitely the golden age, was moving out to California at the beginning, where everything was possible.
Yeah.
You know, for the first time, Warner Brothers was going to start listening to people about what maybe TV or movie shows we could do. And Jeff is like, I'm going to try and make a foothold in TV. And what did we get out of that? We got, you know, Arrow and Flash and Supergirl and Batwoman. Like, we have all of this stuff, and Black Lightning. And that's all because Jeff was like, we can do this, and I can get in front of them. He's, you know, tried to do it with the movies too, and that's a mixed bag because Warner Brothers doesn't want a franchise that way. Like, they just don't. They don't want a Marvel thing. They want separate movies.
Right.
They like that. And so every time he would try and get something started, it would fall apart because there's not the idea of long-range planning. But he's still somebody who loved, like, he comes from, I love this stuff. He's a writer. He's a storyteller. What I loved about Jeff, just as a side thing, is whenever he was working on a new story in the comics still, because he was still writing some comics while he was doing all this other stuff, he would sometimes tell you his idea of like the story he was working on. But he would tell it to you like it was an existing story that he was just reciting, like he had experienced it. And he was like, let me tell you about this thing I saw, because that's how real I think it was in his head. And it was fascinating because I would sit there and listen to this, and I was like, you're not telling this to me like you're making it up. You're telling this to me like you're just telling somebody else's story.
Wow, how fascinating. He was really in.
He's all in. And that's when you work with creative people like that. Like, the other person on the other side of it was Jim Fletcher, who's still at Warner Brothers now. But like, he came in a couple years into, like, I was already at DC by the time he joined DC Direct. But he'd been there then the rest of the time. He's like been DC Direct for so much of it. And I have never in my life met so creative a person. He is literally a ball of creativity. Oh, wow. You cannot pin Jim Fletcher down. He is like the wind. And he has all of these great ideas and the way he thinks about things is so unconventional. Everyone in their life should be lucky enough to meet somebody like him.
So can you give me an example, Kevin, of how that thinking works? Like, when you're trying to create a product, was it about like character selection for Jim, or like How did that kind of help
It's
you?
even more than that, because again, character selection would just assume, and that's where I like love that stuff. That's almost
Yeah,
organizational. Like, let's throw a bunch of names out there and figure out who would be for this reason or that reason. It's almost like casting some, show, or picking somebody from American Idol. I don't know.
yeah,
He is so creative. And again, people will say, oh, so and so is a creative or so and so is a creative.
right.
It's like, no, they don't mean that unless you meet somebody who's truly creative. Where he'll come in and he'll be like, I just drew up this quick thing. And he'll show like I don't know if you know some of these things right at the end that like, DC Collectibles and DC Direct were doing, but like there was this like kind of lucha wrestlers, like
Yeah.
kind
Oh
of thing they
yeah.
were doing, like that were kind of super crazy.
It didn't come out. It sucked. I was
I
like,
know. By the way, we'll have to talk about all the things that never came out, which is
oh
so
yeah,
sad.
yeah,
Because again, that's when like business people stop things.
yeah,
But that's the thing. Jim wasn't about that. He was like, "What about this? What if we
yeah.
mix this and this?" And he would just like he was a big proponent of the Artist Alley series that have a lot of the cool creative looks of different people.
Right.
But he would just like you know kind of draw or doodle little things, and out of it would come all of these great super deformed looks of characters, or just
Yeah.
ways that the characters could mix together, because he already had this base. He was such a comic guy that was inherent in him, and then it was how they came out in all these other expressions that weren't traditional. So you could always go to him and he'd be like, well, what if this weirdo thing happened to this? And the mashup, nobody had Halloween costumes like Jim Fletcher. And that boy would make them all out of cardboard. Like, I don't know how he did it. And
Yeah.
he'd be like, he made a giant Joker fish head one time. And
Yeah.
he was walking around with this giant cardboard painted Joker fish.
Oh my gosh. And
It
then
was like bizarre.
it's funny because you didn't get an action figure of that Joker head, I think, in one of the expressions pack, right? Wasn't it with
Oh
Harley
yeah, there's a
or
little bit.
something?
Yeah, his was even weirder than that. It was like this weird kind of influence, like Japanese, like
Yeah.
like it was really cool. But we would have fun for even that. Like,
Yeah.
I actually still have. Funny enough, he just happens to be sitting here. But one of the things, so one of our guys in the
Yeah.
team, Aaron, had worked up this kind of shape kind of thing
Yeah.
with him, and Sean had been playing with different shapes for like a thing, and we were like, what if it's wood? Like, this is where the weird discussions happen. So it's like a wood character. But one of the things I love is that Jim and I were just like talking, and if you can kind of see it,
Oh
the
yeah.
mouth
Oh,
is
it's
like
just
a
ha
ha ha ha.
ha. That's
And
awesome.
so there is something about that kind of detail. This is like an example of like a Jim Fletcherness
Yeah.
of this thinking outside of the box of, it doesn't speak, but how do we
Yeah.
get the famous thing about Joker is his laugh?
Yeah.
How do we translate that
Oh, that's
in?
brilliant.
And again, it's like these things just are swirling around in somebody like that. That's creative. And that was a joy. So between like Jeff and Jim and the whole team in general,
Yeah.
it was creative energy like crazy. It
Oh
was
man.
just fun.
And you can feel it in the line. I mean, not only your standard figures, but those creative kind of little odd lines, the statues that you guys went with. It was just,
Yeah.
it was amazing. Kevin, taking a step back, one thing that I find interesting is that you said, or we know that when Mattel got the license, they were more focused on Superman and Batman. But I remember at a certain point with like DC Universe Classics, where there was such an overlap between what they were doing and what you guys were doing. And it was like, I remember I had to make a decision in my collecting life because I couldn't afford both back then. Okay, who do I go with? And I stuck with DC Direct just because I love being able to go into a store and buy it. And I also I'm not really into articulation that much. So I liked that they were kind of more like little statues. But then I remembered seeing the same figures from Mattel. Do you remember that happening? Was it like,
Oh yeah, I was still on the other side of it, where I was with the Mattel side while this was
yeah,
going on. So I definitely remember that, because it started to get not contentious, because there was never
yeah,
a part where people were like, obviously it's comic books, nobody's getting mad, but there was a sense of territorialism that was
right,
starting to happen. And part of it was at the beginning, Mattel only had a Superman and a Batman license. They
right,
couldn't do everybody else. But when Mattel started, their big thing was, we're going to get the Four Horsemen to sculpt this. So the Four Horsemen came in off of, being from Todd McFarlane's group to
sure,
start sculpting these things. And those guys are amazing, by the
right,
way. I love them. And they would come into the offices with us because they were in Jersey, so they were local. So they would come in to review sculpts with us directly, as opposed to going out to Warner Brothers. And so they were fans, and they were always trying to like slide things in. For the longest time, I don't think I have it anymore, but I had a gray like cast of a little Starro that was about this big, because they would sculpt twice up. They would do the two ups,
Oh,
so
sure.
the detailing would be there. And it was like it was probably about this big of a Starro, because they had made these Starros that could fit onto the faces of the action figures. It would be a cool accessory. And they couldn't do them at the time because they only had a Superman and a Batman license, and Starro doesn't fall under either of those. So they had to like get rid of that idea. But they were constantly pushing. So they're always saying things to like Mattel, like, what if we also could do these characters? What if we could do these characters?
Yeah.
So there was a little bit of that coming from that side, where most of Mattel didn't care. But then they had like a couple people like Scott Neidlich, who was like working there at the time during some of this, who was like a fan as well. And he was like, what if? Maybe we can make something out of this. So they were starting to understand that there might be a collector's audience for what they were doing. Meanwhile, DC Direct is like, we know there's a collector audience. We have it. Thanks.
Yeah.
Not needed.
We got it covered.
And they were like happy because they carved out this thing of like, they're doing all these other characters like Wonder Woman stuff and Teen Titans and Legion of Superheroes, because nobody can touch them. They didn't even have to ask permission. And then they were starting to get these abilities to do specific versions of Superman and Batman if it was comic related. But then there becomes this weird line of like, well, if they're doing Blackest Night in DC Direct, so we're saying Mattel can't do, like, when eventually they got the full DC Superheroes license and could do Green Lantern characters. So we're going to stop them from doing like, you know, a Pink Lantern and a Yellow Lantern and a Green Lantern. Like, no. So then it started to become this weird discussion of like, well, the styling of the sculpt has to be like an artist's version where they're doing a more generic body.
Right.
No fan sees that difference, not in 3D. No. Like, unless you were doing a real stylized, crazy sculpt, there is not that much, especially when you had, who was it? Not Gary Frank, who was doing it. Was it Ivan Rice was doing so much of the Green Lantern stuff? And his stuff is so classic, basic.
Right.
That is like a basic figure. So then it became really problematic for that period of time of like, DC Direct would constantly challenge and be like, their version can't be like that because that's from a comic book story only. You know, if all of a sudden animation made a version of that storyline, then all of a sudden it was like, oh, now Mattel definitely could do it because it's been in more than one medium and not just comics. And so it became this weird like rules lawyerly thing that would start to happen. And then the same thing would happen on the other side of like, well, you know, you can't have that many Supermans or Batmans in your line, DC Direct. You're starting to abuse it. Where it came to a point where every year when they would kind of start working on the lines, you would have these lists. And for the most part, it was more Mattel giving the list over to DC Direct so they could look through and be like, well, what are you doing? And they'd be like, oh, you're going to do a Dark Knight Returns Batman? I don't know. Like, so that was where it started to get really bad.
So at that point, were you were still on the Mattel side more, like dealing with that?
I was still on the Mattel side, but I was working with I was almost an in-betweener because I was a DC employee. But my job was to get stuff for Mattel. But before I would give stuff to Mattel, I'd have to run it through DC Direct to make sure that they weren't going to be surprised by it, or could we then alter? There were often times where we'd say like, okay, we'll do this. We'll tell Mattel they can still do that figure, but they have to put it out a year after you. And so it would be like things like, so then we would negotiate these kinds of things.
I always, wow, it's so interesting to hear that behind the scenes kind of stuff, because you saw it as a fan and you were just like, this is weird. Why are they both doing the same figures? They're like competing with each other, you know?
Well, and that's the thing, because like if you step back and look, you're like, well, this is just stupid business all around.
Right.
But when two different groups have to have the money they want to make, and they think the way to that are these kinds of decisions, it's hard to stop somebody.
Sure.
Because then you're telling them like, because unfortunately, DC Direct always had this worry of what eventually came true this last year. At some point, they'll just say, we don't need you anymore and we're going to get rid of you. No. And so the more mainstream and, you know, that this nerd effect of us like had in the bigger community, that these companies finally paid attention and said, maybe there's something for us. the less there was a need for an in-house group to do it.
You're right.
But we were doing it better than most of them did because we cared
Absolutely.
more, and it was our own properties. And we could, while it was expensive because we were doing such small runs, we still didn't
Yeah.
have to pay the licensing fee on top of it. So it would be even more affordable than if somebody else was doing similar things. So,
Oh. Well, we'll get to that too. But one line I want to ask you about is this line, the Batman animated series.
I was
So,
there for that.
so Jason Langstrom, I always mess
I
his name.
love Jason.
He loves you too. I before this interview, I messaged him like, "Hey, you know Kevin?" He's like, "Dude,
Oh,
he's like a dear friend
we
of
know
mine."
each other.
Yeah, he's like, yeah. He said, ask you specifically about this line and how it started.
So Jason was a big fan of that line, but Jason worked at Mattel for years, and that's how I knew him, Bill Beneke, a whole bunch of
Okay,
those
there
guys.
you go. That's where it came from.
So I worked with them for years, and every toy fair, every Comic-Con, we would get together. But Jason first came to prominence when he first started at Mattel, and he got put on a Batman animated line, I think it was, or one of the Batman lines we were doing at the time. And he did some packaging first. So he is such a good designer. Like, I cannot say enough. Like, he's a great designer in general, but his packaging specifically on that line was so impressive. We were all like, well, who did that? And when we found out it was this like kid who'd come in who was like working on it, we're like, can we get him on our next packaging? Can we get him on this project?
Oh, that's awesome.
Oh, he's so good. And a good human being.
Hell of a nice guy, man.
Always nice to find in this industry is like, yay, these are good people.
Absolutely. Well, so tell me about it. Tell me about Batman, the animated series. Like, what made you, I mean, by then it was already over, the show.
Oh, the show was so over, and that's why it was such in a way, a weird thing. Again, nobody was really touching it, but this was a Jim Fletcher, myself, and our whole team really was like supportive of it because, I'm slightly older than the 90s kid. I'm more of an 80s kid versus that. So when the superpowers were getting their revival and things like that, that was a bigger deal of the toys. But for me, I was smart enough to know, like, we moved into the 90s. Like, those kids now have money. They're adults with money. Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles was big. Power Rangers was big. And so all this stuff was happening. And we're like, what do we have? And honestly, there was a discussion as we were looking at things of, like, how to keep, again, avoiding Mattel and doing something that we could own that was really specific. And Jim and myself and all, we were looking at different things. And we're like, well, what if we kind of redid the Batman animated stuff? Hasbro did all those figures for years, and even Mattel did a little bit when they first came on. They redid some. I remember. So I was working on some of that stuff, so I still remembered it. So I'm like, was it that long ago? I'm like, it was a while ago. So there was a little bit of this, like, is it the right time? It felt like that was our 90s property to play with. And then we started looking at it, and we're like, and there's a lot we could do. And we know Batman sells, and it's so much Batman. And, we just thought it was like a possibility. The trick was we wanted them to be really posable because we wanted them to be very different from what the first waves were from Hasbro and Mattel. A little bit of scale difference, but also just really movable. We wanted them to have this thing. So one of our guys on the team, Sean Knapp, who was working on it, was like, I love this. He's like, I love this idea. I love these characters. Let me try and work on what these could look like, from an articulation point of view.
Yeah.
And can we get them to look more like the Bruce Timm style than the first round that were like mass toy company versions?
Yeah.
Like, how do we get them to be a little bit more of the look, to be on model? So that was the thinking. Nobody else really wanted to do it. We actually had to throw it by Mattel and say, hey, Mattel, we want to do this. Do you want to do it? And they were like, no, we don't have any interest.
Yeah, because that's a very Batman specific line.
Oh, correct? It was super Batman specific that we could not touch if they had said, don't touch.
Wow.
But, we had another good proponent over at Warner Brothers Consumer Products, Julian Montoya, who's a great toy guy. He'd worked at Lucasfilm in the past, but he'd worked at Warner Brothers for years. And he loved what we did. He understood the need for fans to have something really specific. And he knew Mattel wasn't necessarily going to do it. So he always worked a great line for us whenever we needed something like that. Like, we need them to say yes to this. He'd be like, let me serve it up to them. I will get that,
awesome.
through. And so we were able to, they were like, yep, fine. Nobody cares. Like, and what we started to do by that year or so, we would actually bring in the creatives and some of the marketing from Mattel once a year. And we had this great little war room. It was a tiny little room, and it had all magnetic whiteboard walls
Yeah.
where we would write out and hang up our entire plan for 2 years running of everything we thought for the next 2 years. And we would bring them in and we'd be like, this is what we're planning. So Mattel knew everything we were doing, which sounds weird because they were kind of our competitor, but because we were trying to work this out, we also wanted to be like, you tell us now if something scares you.
Would they ever come in and be like, God damn it, why didn't we think of that? Or like, that looks really cool. Like,
well, a lot of the time, because it was the creatives who had that conversation, because the marketing people didn't care. So the creatives would come in, and like it would be like Bill Beneke or somebody like that who would come in, and he'd be like, we were actually working on this, because they wouldn't always tell us what they were doing in advance. And he's like, oh, we wanted to do that. And that's when we would play the game again of like, well, you guys come out first and we'll wait. You know what I mean? We won't do anything for a bit. We always gave Mattel the first right kind of to do it, so to keep the relationship smooth.
Absolutely.
But again, we all liked each other. We were all fans of this stuff. Some of those guys would buy our stuff, so it was like it was this weird kind of relationship of like, well, we have to keep a business cap on, but we also want this all to happen. More things is just fun for us all. Well, so, then we're like, we're doing Batman animated. And then we had some of the team working on, I think Travis was working on some of the packaging ideas with Brian, where they came up with this like retro kind of fun look. Sean was like working on all the articulation points and how do we do this point and that point? How do we add all of this? The fact that their legs get so small and the skinny ankles were such a problem from the thing. But
man, these guys are hard to stand. Like without the stand,
so hard.
Boom,
well, then we would have stands for a moment. We're like, we're putting stands in, and then we're like, we can't afford to put stands in. Let's remove the stands.
And us fans took that so well when you took away the stand. We're such understanding people, you know?
It's one of those things where what we want to do versus what we can do are two different things. There's never a time when, like, usually when the fan base is like, hey, that sucks. There's usually never a time when we're like, no, it doesn't. Behind the scenes, we're like, yeah, it does. It totally does.
But it's money.
We wish that this would happen instead.
Well, I still kick myself for not getting that Villains 5-pack with Bane and Montoya.
Okay, I loved that pack so much.
Beautiful.
And then we did it, and none of the comic stores ordered it, really. They were like, no, that's too expensive. Nobody wants it. And so then it became really rare because we just didn't have a lot of them out there. But I thought that was so fun, and that was my nod back to one of my first years working with Hasbro and then Mattel. They did the little like in jail set of all the characters in
I remember that one.
So that was my like little nod to that of like, let's do this funny thing. And it's kind of like a play set. This was also me and Jim too. Like we all wanted to do it, but I was really pushing because I was more in power or in control of it, of like play sets. Could we ever afford a play set? And it had started weirdly way back when we were trying for a brief moment to do 3 3/4 inch figures when we were doing the Green Lantern figures that were exclusives at some of the conventions. And we had this great OA play set that had the big lantern they were all on. And we had kept saying like, can we make it? Can we afford to make it? And there was a lot of hemming and hawing and a lot of working with factories in China. And for some reason, they couldn't seem to make it work. But when we did it, I was like, well, we have this. There must be a way to do play sets. That would help separate this. And we're talking like a play set, but / display display area for your figure.
Right. It was a beautiful idea. Like it was a play set, but a collector case.
Lights, like, how do you do all that? So that's where, in a way, the Batcave and then that Renee Montoya set both came out of. They were like two versions of that. One was, what if the packaging is also like a set? You know, you buy your bat signal separate and you can put it on top of this package and it's kind of a set versus we're just going to do the Batcave and we're going to make the Batcave a plastic set.
Which is beautiful, by the way. I have the back. It's not displayed because it's taking the space, but it's man, and of course the Batmobile and the Batwing. Holy shit! Like I still have my Batmobile up there, but it's like, was that just an easy one? Like, okay, let's do a Batmobile, or how did you
none of that was easy. I got to tell you, none of that was easy in the way that it should have been in a way. But I'm most proud of those things.
Yeah.
because they're most representative of the doing something for the fan base
Yeah.
that we wanted to do, which to me was what made it DC Direct, DC Collectibles, and
Yeah.
not just a licensee. Again, if we're doing Batman animated figures, that's great. But how are we upping this
Yeah.
to a level of for the fan? And a little bit of it was probably inspired by like what you see going on with Mattel and doing like Castle Grayskull or you see
Yeah.
Snake Mountain kind of stuff where they're like over the top and all. We just had a lot of problems being able to afford these things because it was a double thing of like the comic shops had to buy these
Yeah.
things. We weren't selling direct to fans. And so no matter how much fans said they wanted it, if there weren't pre-orders or if the comic shops couldn't float the money to buy these things to have them in their stores, we couldn't make them. So we went on a little bit of a press tour, like from Toy Fair to like Comics Pro, which is another meeting, to like San Diego Comic Con, to really pump these up. When the first the Batcave came or the Batmobile, we were like, look how cool this is. And we had to work real hard to make sure people understood how cool this could be, because otherwise we wouldn't have done it. We also were lucky because Jeff Johns was still in charge of our group at the time.
Yeah.
And that boy's creative like that, and he gets it. And he's like, sure. If we're not sure if we're going to make money on it, but let's do it. And then the long game worked out.
Yeah.
The problem with where it is now, with where DC Direct is now or not, is because they started getting people in charge right around the time that I left who were more interested in what's the most efficient money-making thing.
Right. Right.
And so then you can't have that unless a comic shop says, I'm ordering a ton of these. You don't have the risk. The best example, I'm just going to side note for a second.
Yeah.
The best example of this, unfortunately, was the Bombshells action figure line.
Oh, beautiful line.
Wave 1 was amazing.
Yeah.
Wave 2, oh, some of the articulation got cut. Oh, wave 3 and 4 didn't happen.
Yeah.
So what that was exactly decisions made for money only. And I think that line would have lived if we'd given it time to breathe and go out there and people to start collecting. But because initial orders weren't high enough, then all of a sudden it's like, don't do it. That was the danger of Batman Animated. That was always the danger of Batman Animated.
And Kevin, with that, could you guys not sell directly to the fans? Was that like a legal thing where you can just open like a DC Direct website and sell directly, or is that wasn't really?
It wasn't a legal thing. It was more of an operations setup thing.
Yeah.
We were a small group, and that would have required some people in other departments to work more. Like I would say, while I love many of the other people at DC, many of them got annoyed that they had to do work for DC Direct and DC Collectibles sometimes because, you know, they had their other jobs working on things. And so then you have somebody who's like, oh, you also have to sell our stuff, not just the comics, but you have to sell product. And a lot of those people were coming from publishing and from the comics world. So they didn't know or care about some of this stuff. So we had a lot of responsibility to make our stuff happen. And we didn't have enough people or expertise to set up our own site. I thought there was going to be a big I guess change once DC Universe, the the online subscription service had happened, and that was going to be our big thing of like the Justice League figures will be available through there, and then we'll start selling direct to people, and that kind of didn't work, right? I mean, I left right around the time, like right as it was launching, and it was slow to launch. The model was weird, the pricing was odd, like we couldn't, there was just a lot of issues. But there were many times that Jim Fletcher and I would just talk about like how, oh, if we could just sell to people directly. And so we talked to people like, Sideshow, who sells directly to people, Sideshow Collectibles, but they're like, we just want your statues. We don't want to be in the action figure business. And so where something like Batman Animated could have got maybe some other characters like Red Claw, we used to always talk about things like that were like, oh, let's do those, and Rupert Thorne, whatever. But we knew that those were going to be so minor that there's no way. If the Renee Montoya, like the whole idea of the Renee Montoya pack was to get out Renee Montoya, who would not survive on her own. Yeah. So we're like, we've got to package these together. But when you package, the price is bigger. Comic shops get so scared because you got to remember they're like floating by sometime month to month. They don't have money. They don't have cash to like put out for these things. And we were asking a lot. I wish we had figured out a way to sell online.
Me too. Well, let's really depress people now. You touched on the Red Claw. You touched on Rupert Thorne. So
I will tell you, Jim Fletcher and I, every year, every
yeah,
season we were planning things, would go into the whiteboard room on the wall and write out every character still left from
yeah,
literally we go to Wikipedia to make sure we didn't miss anybody. We would write them all out and
yeah,
be like, who could survive? And we would be like, and the reason why I mentioned Red Claw is because that's one we circled numerous times. We're like,
yeah,
Red Claw, we should do Red Claw. And then we would come up with it. And from a business point of view, it was hard to push over to say to people, we're going to sell enough when we couldn't even sell. Because we would have then numbers on like, how did Harvey Bullock do? How
yeah.
did like, and they weren't
Uh,
great, you know? And when I say weren't great, they weren't great from a plastic is expensive.
yeah,
Plastic is expensive to do, and articulated plastic is more expensive. Why is there like 500 million Batman black and white statues? Because they're cheaper. Resin is easy to do. And perceived value, that's a statue. You
yeah,
can charge more for that. We are all in a mentality of like, this is plastic, it's disposable. I want a cheap $9 figure.
yeah,
No, that's like a $25 figure. What? $25 for
yeah.
this? I was like, believe me, we weren't making big money off these things. It's just that we were that small a group and it was that small a run. And so for a moment, we even tried to do the thing of like, why don't we just, we're only making like 5,000 of these things. Why don't we just number them like that because it's so small? But then weirdly in the fan community, the perception is 5,000 is a lot. And it was like,
Well,
no, no, no. Like mass toy companies are
yeah,
making 50,000. They're making 100,000 of these things. And that's how they have the price that they have.
sure.
We're only literally making 5,000 of these, and that's all that will ever be made. But when you only have 4,000 people who are interested, it seems like it's a lot.
I know. And when you're on the message boards and whatnot, it feels like there's so many people who want this, but it's really a very small group.
Because I said 4,000 is a lot.
Yeah,
If you had a message board with 4,000 people who are vocal, that's a ton.
right.
But it's
Well,
still, for plastic, that's still just not, that's still collectible. That's still just niche.
what other figures were you guys trying to get out from the animated line? Red Cloud, Rupert Thorne. Do you remember any of the other? I know we finally got Grey Ghost. He's over there. Thank God. We got Grey Ghost. But who else?
Well,
Uh,
there was a moment too that we were thinking how to expand to like the motorcycle world, and we did the
yeah,
one Batman right as I left. I think Batman
right.
was done, but there was like going to be a Nightwing on a motorcycle. We were like, how do we get like some more vehicles? Like we liked expanding the world too,
Yeah,
because the problem was as we looked at the characters, they were really getting obscure, and we just were like using the kind of level. I keep saying Harvey, but like he's probably the most obscure one there to use as an example of the Harvey level of like, are they going to sell more than that? But we wanted to do, we never did Hard Act, did we?
no.
That
Oh,
was
wait,
the
no, no,
other
no.
one.
You did.
Or
You
did
did. You did
we?
the Cyborg Batman. Yeah, Hard Act. Yeah,
Yes.
you did
Okay.
it.
No, he just came out because
Right.
that was the after I left. We had never gotten to Hard Act, but those extra new ones that like they've just been doing like right at the end here, those were some of those were like Jim Fletcher and I wanting to always do and that we never got done. Jim was more of a proponent. I did not feel this way, and stupid of me, but I just didn't. He liked the idea of going to doing characters that never were in the series, but
Yeah.
in that style, which they've since done. Like I think they did
Right.
Red Hood and Deathstroke and such. But I was always a fan of like, well, shouldn't we do more of the actual characters before we go to that?
Yeah.
Or I was like, let's go into Justice League Animated, which is still in that
Yes.
Rustum style, and go to all those characters instead. But Jim, and I think Jim was smarter in a way, because again, obviously Red Hood, those are cool
Yeah.
characters you would have never seen. And he was able to get, I think, Ty Templeton or somebody to draw them in the comic
Right.
book too. So there's like a legitimacy, which is nice.
Yeah.
But at the time we were still looking at things like, let's see, not Red Claw. Who was the other one that we were looking at? It was Hardak, Red Claw. I mean, Grey Ghost we ended up doing.
Yeah.
Oh my gosh, who else is it?
Was it the Judge maybe, or
no,
or Lockup, or
we looked at everybody, but we didn't think of them. It was it another female character? It wasn't like Vesper Fairchild or somebody like that, but it was like oh no, Summer Gleason is the one that we kept coming up, because like we started to look and we're like, oh, Rupert Thorne and Summer Gleason are in all these episodes,
Yeah.
but we're like, really? Does anybody need
oh,
those?
I would have loved that.
I know it's great, but
Yeah.
it's like, yeah.
I know.
So instead, our kind of new strategy was those expression packs.
Yeah.
which we did I think only 3 sets of at the time, but like we wanted to do a ton of those because it was a way to go back. We had so many construction problems with the
Yeah.
first wave of figures because the plastic was falling apart.
Oh, I remember. Yeah.
Oh yeah, right.
You know,
I
you
wrote.
guys handled that well, really well, though. You know, but I
I don't.
remember.
One
Yeah.
thing I will pat myself on the back for
Yeah.
trying to cover that because up to that point, I don't think DC Direct had ever really reached out for any problems like that to
Yeah.
people. They had a customer service email that kind of went into a black hole, and then maybe it was taken care of or not. I found Jim and I were so passionate about the Batman animated line, and I was like, I will not let this fall apart just
Yeah.
because of bad construction. And so I was like, we will bend over backwards if we have to make sure that the people who we did this for get something usable. And so literally went to some of besides a toy fair talking about it and having some of those reporters report on it, we went to a couple of websites and said, please repost on these websites
Right.
to contact us. Because I didn't want it to just be like, well, if they have a problem, they'll let us know. I was like, well, if the hardcore fans see this somewhere, I need them to find me.
Yeah.
And I wrote many a letter on my little
Yeah.
cardboard cards, handwritten, to say, here is a replacement figure for you. We had a database. It was an Excel chart, but it was like of all the names of anybody who contacted us with a problem to
Yeah.
say, okay, we have to send one out. And we didn't have some of them yet. So there was a wait of like, God, it was like 6 months or more
Yeah.
before the second wave of better constructed ones came in. And so some of those people, and I feel bad because some of those people never got back again. Like when we reached out to them, they never gave me their address. So there were some people who were unhappy and just walked away, which happens. And
Yeah.
our fault. We gave them crappy merchandise. But
That must have been kind of
then
heartbreaking, right? Like you had the animated line, you're so excited,
heartbreaking.
you
You
know?
don't understand what it was like behind the scenes to see that and to be like, well, no, maybe it was just a weird one case, and then we would get some and we'd open up our samples.
Yeah.
Because here's the problem. At that point, we didn't have an office in China that was there to watch over the factories.
Yeah.
We are hiring a factory to do this. We have to trust the factory engineers that they know something about what they're doing.
Yeah.
We understand the concept of it, but we're not making it. And so if they use a cheapy plastic, or unfortunately the culture of China is, yes, we can do that. Yes, we can do that. They say yes to everything. So they do it, and then they make it too thin at the ankles. They do this thing where they use the wrong plastic mix, whatever. They make them. They're not going to necessarily tell us.
Yeah.
They're going to let things, if it can get by their testing enough, we are like, okay, sure, we trust you. And then we get our samples in around like a couple weeks before the comic shops would get them. So even if there was a major problem,
And then you're just like,
they're already shipped. And then
yeah.
it's like, uh-oh. So in that case, they were already in stores. And then we were like, wait, what are people saying?
Yeah.
Because our samples along the way were fine. Because remember, again, the factory is choosing which couple samples to send us.
Yeah.
So they're not going to send us ones if they break 10, but these other ones are fine. They're like, oh, send those.
Oh,
So we would get those and they're fine. And then, it's just part of it is we rush people too. We would always be like, now, like we spend all this time developing and then we're like, but we need these in for Christmas, or we set this date because we put them into comic shops that they can have them in this month. You got to hurry up. You got to hurry up. Again, China will say, sure, yeah, we can. Even though they should say, no, we need the 2 extra months you just tried to like cut from us. And so things get made a little shoddier than they would have been because you're rushing them. And so, old DC Direct was brilliant in a way. They used to be like, it'll take us as long as it takes us.
Right.
And whenever it comes out, it comes out.
You were trying to hit dates or anything, really.
Yeah. And then so by the time I was there, we were like, we must have a schedule and hit these things like a real company. But unfortunately, that means your partner has to be, and you have to have checks and balances in a way that you can't just let it go. And so after that debacle, we did get about 3 employees that were over based in Hong Kong. Now, again, they weren't in the factories. We didn't own our own factory. Like Mattel owns their own factory. Lego has some of their own factories. We did not. We're a small little group. So we had to still trust a little bit. And,
Speaking of that a little bit, Kevin, like, so, DC Directs are very small, but you kind of sound like you're getting some aspirations. You know
Oh
what I
yeah.
mean? Like you're becoming a little bit bigger. Was there ever a thought to make it really big and make it a big toy company, or were you always trying to stay kind of under the radar, but like push it a little bit with what you were doing, or like what was that like? Because you're growing, but still trying to stay small. It sounds like.
They definitely wanted us to grow money wise.
Yeah.
That's always the goal of any company. Like your bosses are always like, what's your money? They don't care about anything else. But they also knew there was always this weird thing of like, don't get too loud because then Warner Brothers will notice.
Yeah.
Because right now we're loud in DC world and in the DC fan, base, and they're aware of us, but you don't want to get too big because then again they're going to say, no, we get money from and less risk from going to Mattel. Because if their stuff falls apart or they break something, they're responsible for that. We just
Right.
yell at them. We can sue them for this or that. We don't have to worry about it. With DC Direct, it's trickier because the bigger we got and the more like a toy company we got, the more attention would be put on us and the more reason of like, well, why do you exist? And the
Interesting.
more
Okay.
we did, like my problem ethically at the end and why I left was because I had a disagreement basically with my new boss that came in at that time who was from the finance world. And their point of view was make more money and don't do action figures because action figures have the worst profit margin.
Oh
So do more
no.
statues, do more statues.
Yeah.
And I was like, well, I don't agree to that. And then my contract was up and they're like, maybe you shouldn't stay. And I was like, maybe I shouldn't because I
Oh
don't think I agree
no.
to this. And they didn't want me to respond anymore to customer service emails. Like there was all this stuff they didn't want me to do that I was like,
That's not who you are. That's not who the company was.
Well, it's not
Yeah.
how I perceived what
Yeah.
DC Direct was there for, but that was changing. And obviously it changed so much even after I left that they finally were doing what the worry was, which is, well, we don't need that anymore.
I want to talk about that at the end of DC Direct and you leaving and all that. But there's so many figures that were not released over the years, and it sounds like I'm trying to get a sense of why, right? Like,
Well, especially during my tenure, near the middle to end of it, there was a lot of stuff not released. And that was really all financial reasons.
Yeah.
In every way, they were killed by somebody at a higher level based on orders of a previous figure or something else that came out that they then said, I'm no longer backing this. You can't do it. So that was the biggest thing. And it was like the Icons line, which I was a big fan of. I was like such a fan of that line. I loved the idea of the accessories, the kind of playing, the different heads, the fun idea of how those characters used their powers.
Yeah.
I was a huge fan of that. I mean, you can watch almost any video of us at Toy Fair, Jim and I talking, and we were both like so excited for that. And then that's around when the changes started to happen, when Jeff was moving on to be more of a producer of like just film and TV. And so he was going to be leaving and we were going to be reporting into a financial base. It hadn't quite happened yet, but it was things were starting to happen above us. And the financial team just in general would come in and say like, nope, you're going to have to cancel Booster Gold and Blue Beetle. Yeah, you have to cancel cancel this whole line. Like this whole line's gone. The movie specific figures. No, cancel those lines. Like you can't do the extra characters for Man of Steel. You can't do. We had so much planned. We had all these Suicide Squad characters planned, and in some cases, like sculpted up. Meaning, there's like master sculpts of like a lot of these figures. That's how far we went. We could not go into production. They wouldn't let us on things, and so
I remember. Yeah, because I know it's the most heartbreaking thing for a fan. Like we don't know all this stuff, right? We see the images. You guys get us so excited. Like the movie line, the
so
icons.
fun.
And full disclosure, the icons line I did not support initially because of the scale. That really bothered me. I ended up buying all of them, but that bothered me at first. What was the thinking?
I was a proponent of the lower scale, like the not 7-inch, the 6-inch.
Yeah.
But then when they came in, there was, again, people were rushing.
Yeah.
They came in smaller even than they were supposed to because they came in at like not quite even 6 or something.
Right.
We wanted them to be like in scale with each other a little bit, just a little bit. And so we wanted like a Batman, Superman, who we consider like, you consider them the normal scale, like the normal height. And then everybody else, some women are like shorter, some like monster characters bigger. And so they were supposed to be like a little over 6 inches or something. And they all came in like super tiny and thin, like they shrunk.
Right.
Because there is shrinkage that happens like when you go over and mass produce from what because the thing is, you have a sculptor, and most of our sculptors were like, controlled by DC. They weren't being done over in China because we're getting much higher quality. But then they hand them over. And then what happens is when they're produced, they shrink a slight percentage. You're supposed to take that into account. And so make them a little thicker, bigger. For some reason with that line, I don't know if it's because they were rushed or what happened because of all the new articulation put in. I don't know what happened to it, but they came in and we were like, what?
Oh no.
But at that point, it was too late again.
Yeah.
And so there's a lot of problems of poor management, and I'll take full, responsibility of the fact that like the team should have been more on some of those decisions when we were starting a new line, but they were always running a little behind. You know what I mean? There was just like slowness for some things. And that one was really sad to me because they came out too tiny. And I don't mean even just height, but like they're just tiny.
And we noticed, and they were so cool though. Like eventually I fell in love with that line.
Well,
it got you to the box set with all the Justice League. It was amazing.
That line was great. Oh God, but can we talk about that Wonder Woman in that box set?
She's a little tall.
She's a little tall and a little ugly and weird. And like that one was like a disaster. Again, that came in and we're like, maybe no one will notice. I can't tell you how many times that happens behind the scenes. There are times, and then we have to put on a brave face and we're like, look at these great figures.
Of course.
Like, don't look there. Don't look over there. That was a rough one. And also that set was the change in a way. That's just like that, because no accessories. Like it was very like, look here, buy this. Right. And it did well. We sold, those things as like sets of 7 Justice Leaguers because comic shops were like, oh, we'll buy a set of Justice League figures. Right. To them, that made business sense. The fans, I don't think that was a great service to them. And obviously the Icon line, I would have loved to continue. We started to correct the scale, if you notice. Oh, the ones that came out started to get a little taller and better. And we would have eventually fixed probably the older characters.
Then you have reviewers like me and the internet who were like, why is this not even in scale with itself? You know what I mean? And like, that's a problem. It's not a problem, I guess, but it's like...
Oh, no, it's totally a problem because you've spent money. You have spent money already on the earlier figures. Right. And just because we don't like them or we think we messed up and we're trying to fix it, screw that. Like, we messed up and now you have paid money for something that isn't right in your display. It isn't something like we're going to ask you later to just throw it away because we didn't like it or do it right. That's really not cool. But we were trying to listen to the fans and listen to the reviews and fix the scale in this like slight way.
Yeah. Well, at least it's comforting to know that you guys were trying to fix it. That this is hard when you're a fan. You don't hear much from the company. Like it's. And what are you going to say, really? Like, the things you're talking about, because you still are trying to sell a product. You can't just come out and trash your own figures, because that doesn't make any sense, but at least you guys were thinking about it.
We were always thinking about it, but we always knew, I mean, every once in a while we would have a disagreement of like somebody liked something and somebody didn't. It was more just an aesthetic thing. But when there were like ugly figures or poor, like, scale or something like that, like we knew.
Yeah.
We knew.
So, Kevin, let's talk about, we already touched on this a little bit when you left. It was changing, DC directors changing, and the fans saw it. We kind of smelled it. Like, you have DC Essentials, which I love. I'm a DC fanboy, so I love those figures.
Oh, I could tell you about those now.
Yes.
Oh my gosh, I could tell you about this. So, DC Icons happening.
Yeah.
We were starting to get better, but because we were adding accessories and all these features and they had more articulation, they were more expensive to make. They were a lot more. And we kept having to raise the price because finance kept saying, no, your margin isn't there. Your margin isn't there. And comic shops were getting upset that we were raising the price. And fans were like, why are you charging $28, $30, whatever? So then the other side of it was comic shops would say, well, we just need basic figures. We just need these basic figures that, would always be in our shops. And we always need a Batman, a Superman. We don't care what it looks like. We don't care what it is. We just need when a little Timmy comes in with his mom that we have a Batman to sell him, a Superman to sell him. So there was the idea of using, and this is horrible, but using a basic body, repainting it, and doing it because that would be cheaper.
Right.
And that was to mollify the finance team. And and at this point then I had a new boss, and it was a finance-based person. And they were like, what are you doing? I don't want you to do these icons. The icons line is dead. If you can't make these numbers, they're dead. And I'm like, well, we can't seem to get comic shops to buy them in big enough numbers. So I guess it's dead. But we should still do action figures because we're desperately still trying to hold on to plastic. Because again, they're pushing us to do just statues. And we're like, let's do plastic. So out of that came two things. One was the Artist Alley line, which was like a vinyl plastic thing, but not articulated, and also super creative. So it allowed us to be creative. And then Essentials, right? Is that what it was called, Essentials?
Yeah.
Because we had another name. I hated DC Essentials for that name because we had a better name. Oh, what was it? And it was so much better. And then they're like, no, just call it Essentials. I'm like, God, we might as well call it like Encyclopedia Britannica.
I know, right?
Name. Oh, what was it? It was something that was great too. Oh my God, I can't believe I've forgotten it. But it was like DC something. It'll come to me at some point. And Jim Fletcher and I used to get so upset and cry over the fact that we had to be like DC Essentials, like a toy fair that next year, because we had a better name. And we had all approved the name like in our group. And then it went to finance and marketing, and they were the ones who were like, no, just call it DC Essentials. It'll be like our books. Because they were selling DC Essential stories, comic books. So they thought from a branding point of view it fit because they were selling it mostly for comic shops. And I'm like, yes, but we still have fans who might buy these, but whatever. Yeah. So long story short, DC Essentials was not the name we liked, but that's what we had to sell. So we did the first couple 5 or 6 of them or whatever it was that we put out there, and it was like Flash. It was all people who had like media coming, whether it was the Justice League movie or TV shows that we wanted to have out there because, you want a Green Arrow, you want a Flash, you want a Superman, a Batman, a Wonder Woman. And then that was supposed to be it. There were supposed to be no more figures other than those like 5 or 6. And then Jim and I were like, we are not going to go quietly. I was like, I am going to make this into an action figure line if it kills me. And so I was like, look, we have shared bodies now, so we have a little bit of leeway. What characters can we do that are just paint redecos to a degree but feel different? Can we resculpt heads at least? Resculpting a head is not nearly as expensive. So that's where things like the villain idea started coming up. And then we were like, oh, look, what if there's like a play? Like, so you have conflict play. Who are these characters that we can get? So Shazam and Black Adam, Flash, Reverse Flash, like they're basically like almost the same character anyway with just a resculpted head normally. So we started.
You got the Doomsday Clock ones too, which I think were brilliant, like Rorschach, Dr. Manhattan. You know what I mean? And those were. We
started those too back. I was still there at that time because again, Jeff, being great, is like, I'm working on this thing. And we're like, good, Jeff, you're the only writer we know who like works that far in advance. Yeah. And he's like, and it may be like 12 issues. I'm like, good, that gives us a year. And then I was like, and then Jeff John's time, probably longer than a year because that does not come out in a month. And so we didn't know at the time that was going to really be drawn out, but I was like, good chance it'll get drawn out. So we're like, let's try that. I mean, again, it supports an event. It's some shared body stuff we can do. It's these characters from Watcher. Like it just ticked a lot of boxes. And so we started having to play this game internally of trying to convince these finance people that like it was worth doing because we weren't spending much money, but getting more and more characters out there. Yeah. Sadly, as soon as I left, I think that was the last of the Essentials line because it takes a while after somebody leaves for the stuff to actually get out there. Yeah. You don't recognize it because they've now shut down the whole thing. But if DC Directed continued on, you'd notice that Essentials would have stopped.
I mean, we definitely noticed, like, for me, when you guys started reusing the bodies, because before everything was brand new skull. So, but I appreciate them. Like, you guys are trying to survive, and they were awesome. Even like the Red Hood that you guys did, like the Essentials version was awesome. So I liked it. But yeah, we definitely felt like that was sort of
because the question becomes why? Like at that point, DC, and this is the thing I used to struggle with, but again, we were just trying to hold like a foothold of like do something in plastic that's action figure. But the question becomes, why DC Direct? Why are you doing that? Why don't I just wait for a cheaper,
Yeah.
maybe better made Mattel version? You know? And so that was the sadness, because that was the consolation prize to the Icons line.